There are a wide variety of weapons in Cuphead, each with their own unique playstyles. But what makes a weapon good or bad? Well, I've taken on the task of ranking every weapon in Cuphead from worst to best. I've laid out 3 categories in which each weapon will get a score out of 10. Those categories being practicality, or how practical I think a weapon is as a whole, usage, or how much I personally use a weapon, and EX, or how useful I believe a weapon's EX shot is. But without further ado, let's see how each weapon stacks up against each other on this tier list. Coming in 10th place, the worst weapon in Cuphead is the uncharged charge shot. And it can't get any worse than this, as it scores a 0 in every category. First off, you can't actually buy this weapon from Porkrine, but is instead accessible through the charge shot, which we'll be seeing later in this video. With the charge shot equipped, if you simply tap the shoot button instead of holding it down like normal, you will get what's called the uncharged charge shot. But what makes this weapon so bad? Well, to start with, this weapon is just a nuisance to use. Having to constantly tap the trigger for each shot can get super annoying and tiring. Just try using this weapon for yourself if you don't believe me. This weapon's damage output is so horrible, only being slightly better than Chaser's damage output, except you have to precisely aim for each shot. And the uncharged charge shot is so small that a lot of the time, many of your shots aren't even doing damage. So in terms of practicality, I can't think of a certain situation in which you would want to use this weapon before turning to literally anything else, which is why I'm giving it a 0. As for usage, the only times I've ever used this weapon was for my 2 uncharged shot challenge videos, which you should definitely check out after this video. But besides those 2 instances, I don't use this weapon, so it gets another 0. Finally, the uncharged charge shot gets a 0 in the EX category as well. But you may be thinking, since you already have the charge shot equipped, won't you be using the charge EX if you press the EX button? Well, yes, but I just find it more appropriate to pair the charge EX with the actual charge shot, so I'm not really taking EX into consideration here. All I have to say is this weapon sucks, so save yourself the time, trouble, and pain and just stay away from it. That is, unless you're doing some insane challenge with this weapon like I did, in which case, let me know in the comments. But on to our next weapon. In number 9, the first actual weapon on this list, we have Twist Up. This weapon scores a 4.5 out of 30, so it's better than the uncharged charge shot 0, but it's still very bad. Let's find out why. First off, for practicality, I'm giving this weapon a 2. Twist Up was one of the 3 weapons introduced with the DLC, and by far the worst of the 3. This weapon shoots out an upwards curve of little tornadoes that actually has a decent damage output. That is, if you can get your shots to hit, which is the main problem here. This weapon is really only alright if bosses are directly above you, which is most often not the case, and in any other situation, aiming with this weapon is just a huge pain. Because of the awkward curve, it's very hard to actually shoot where you want to, and at times just impossible. That being said, this weapon isn't completely terrible on some DLC bosses like Glumstone the Giant, and actually works fine for the secret boss, but there are just so many better options when it comes to weapons. While there aren't a lot of practical uses for this weapon, it's not completely useless in a few situations, but that being said, I can't give it more than a 2. Moving on to usage, Twist Up only gets worse, coming out at a 0.5. The only place I actually use Twist Up over any other weapon is on the final phase of Captain Brinybeard. I made a short about the technique I'm using if you want to check it out, but I'm not going to get into it here. I'm just not a fan of using Twist Up personally, and in any situation where it works alright, there's just going to be another weapon that does it better. The only exception again being the final phase of Captain Brinybeard, but since this is literally the only phase out of every boss that I prefer this weapon on, 0.5 is the best it will get in this category. Finishing up with the EX category, Twist Up scores a 2. This EX, like the weapon in general, just doesn't cut it for me. According to the Cuphead wiki, Twist Up's EX has a max damage of 48, which is more than every other EX, but the problem is getting this EX to do damage. When you use the Twist Up EX, it spins around you in a circle a few times, damaging whatever it comes into contact with. However, because of the wide range of movement this EX has, it usually only hits a boss 1 to 2 times, resulting in quite a low amount of damage. Since this is the case, I never find myself using Twist Up's EX, therefore giving it a score of 2, and because Twist Up has a lot of room for improvement, I think an overall score of 4.5 is quite appropriate. Coming in number 8, we have Chaser. Chaser barely comes out above Twist Up, sitting at a score of 5 out of 30. For practicality, I'm giving this weapon a 1, mainly because of one other weapon, which is Crack Shot. Like Crack Shot, Chaser basically locks all your shots onto the boss you're fighting, but unlike Crack Shot, Chaser has the lowest damage output of every weapon. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to not have to worry about aiming when you're first starting the game, but in 99% of situations, Crack Shot will do the same job much better. So in practical terms, Chaser will almost always be beaten out by Crack Shot, which is why I'm giving it a score of 1 in this category. Looking at usage, Chaser gets a 1 as well, and this is mostly for the same reason I just talked about for practicality. I only regularly use Chaser on the third and final phases of Chef Saltbaker, since in my opinion, Chaser locks on just a little bit better than Crack Shot in these situations. But I literally don't use Chaser anywhere else, as it will always fall behind Crack Shot, which is why I'm giving it such a low score. We see Chaser's highest score, which is still only a 3 in the EX category. According to the Cuphead wiki, Chaser's EX has a max damage of 28, which I question if that's actually correct, but nonetheless, Chaser doesn't completely suck in this category. We'll just call it pretty bad. Using Chaser's EX will spawn some Chaser bullets that spin around you in a circle that will deal damage on impact. However, you can really only deal decent damage if you get right up in an enemy's hitbox, but if you can already get this close, most EX shots from other weapons higher up on this list will simply do better. Chaser's EX can also sort of act as a shield to incoming objects, but it's really not all that effective. It's not the worst EX in the game, but it's also far from the best, so a 3 is where I'm putting Chaser in this category. While an appealing weapon for new players who don't want to aim, Chaser will always get overshadowed by Crack Shot, which is why I just can't rank it higher than 8th place. Next up in 7th place, more than doubling Chaser's score, we have Pea Shooter, which scores a 12 out of 30. We've gotten past the weapons that are really bad, and now we're starting to get more into the middle of the pack. Pea Shooter is the weapon you start out with and is almost the definition of an average weapon. It has fine damage output and its EX works okay as well, but let's get into our 3 categories. For practicality, I'm giving this weapon a 6. As I've said, Pea Shooter is pretty average, so it plays as such. Pea Shooter really isn't a terrible pick for most bosses and can usually make pretty decent work of them. However, for bosses that aren't stationary, or if there are a lot of projectiles to dodge at once, this weapon falls a bit behind. Basically, Pea Shooter only deals alright damage when you actually have the luxury to aim without moving too much. But where this weapon really falls behind is in the usage category, as I've given it a 0 here. I never use this weapon on any boss unless I'm using it for a challenge. Since Pea Shooter is such a basic weapon, there's nothing much in particular that it does super well on, so at least for me in every situation, I'm just always gonna pick a different weapon. Pea Shooter makes up for this a little with its EX, however, as I'm giving it a 6 here. When you use Pea Shooter's EX, it shoots out a horizontal blast that can deal up to 25 damage. It's really pretty easy in most situations to deal damage, but there are a few reasons I'm only giving Pea Shooter 6 points in this category. Since this EX shoots off horizontally, many times bosses' hitboxes are too small for it to do a lot of damage. And even if you do achieve max damage, other EXs on this list are simply gonna do more damage regardless. All in all, Pea Shooter isn't horrible, but more than half the weapons in the game just beat it out in my opinion. Coming in at number 6 with a total score of 13 out of 30, we have Converge, which actually only scores 1 point higher than Pea Shooter. For practicality, I've given Converge a 6. This weapon basically splits apart into 3 energy beams that spread outwards. Using Weapon Lock will reduce the spread. In terms of damage output, it's actually pretty good, but like the case for many of the weapons before Converge on this list, it's hard to get all your shots to hit most of the time. But Converge does have a special feature that did rank it up a bit more for me. Most weapons' bullets will stop once they hit an enemy's hitbox, but Converge is a little different. Instead of stopping at a hitbox, Converge will pass through enemies and deal damage to whatever it comes into contact with until it leaves the screen. In practical terms, there aren't a ton of situations where this actually helps, but for the bosses that it does, Converge can make fairly quick work. This brings us to our next category of usage, where I've given Converge a 2. Although Converge's special feature is nice, I don't find myself using it all that much. On a regular basis, I'll use Converge on the Phantom Express and the Devil. well. On these two bosses, Converge works super well because it can get rid of the eyeballs on the Phantom Express and the blue imps on the Devil with ease. However, since I don't think Converge comes out on top in any other situation, I can't give it more than a 2. Converge's EX could be better, but it could definitely be worse as well, so I've given it an average score of 5. In terms of damage, Converge's EX is really pretty terrible. According to the Cuphead wiki, this EX does 21 damage, which has one of the worst damage outputs of any EX. On the bright side, it is very easy to actually get this EX to hit, which is more than I can say about many other EXs with better damage outputs. This EX can also deal damage to multiple enemies in a row, just like the Converge shot, but I hardly ever find this useful. If this EX had better damage, I would definitely rank it up here, but unfortunately that isn't the case, so a 5 is where I'm putting it. Converge isn't a terrible weapon, but now we're getting into the upper half of weapons, and they'll be getting a lot better. Starting out the top 5 best weapons in Cuphead with a score of 16 out of 30, we have Lobber. This might be a bit of a controversial pick, but I do have my reasons for liking it. That being said, this weapon isn't perfect, which brings us to our first category. I scored Lobber a 3 in practicality, as it just doesn't do the job for most bosses. Lobber shoots an arc of purple balls upwards that fall back down. The first reason I've scored Lobber so low here is because of its range. Since Lobber doesn't shoot very far, it's very inefficient for most bosses in Cuphead. If the boss you're fighting is above you, at this point you might as well be using any other weapon. While the range of this weapon is pretty bad, the damage output of Lobber is actually very good. If you can get your shots to hit, you can make very quick work of bosses, which is seen the best on Grim Matchstick. There are also a few situations in the game where you can set up something called a Lobber trap. The Lobber balls basically bounce a few times before actually disappearing, so you can use this to your advantage by looking up and jumping. And if an enemy comes into contact with this trap, you will be dealing a massive amount of damage. But this Lobber trap and high damage output of the weapon itself aren't enough to outweigh the disadvantage of Lobber's range, so I just can't give it more than a 3 here. I've also scored Lobber a 3 in usage as well. Because of how impractical this weapon is, I just don't use it much. As I've said, this weapon's range renders it ineffective on most bosses, however, there are a few situations in which this weapon is an absolute beast. Lobber feels almost solely designed for Grim Matchstick, as in all of his phases, he's in the perfect position to deal damage with Lobber. I will also sometimes use Lobber on Rumor Honeybottoms in a few other situations here and there. But since these are about the only instances in which I use a Lobber, it won't be scoring higher than a 3 in this category. But where Lobber really shines in my opinion is in its EX. I've scored it a perfect 10 here and is the highest scoring EX on this list. Lobber's EX basically is just a bigger version of one of the Lobber balls and deals damage on impact. According to the Cuphead wiki, Lobber's EX deals 28 damage, which is quite high in terms of EXs. On top of that, it's also very easy to hit bosses with this EX. If you have 3 or 4 of these EXs built up, you'll be dealing massive damage in a short amount of time and will make quick work of almost any boss. Oftentimes, I'll take Lobber as my secondary weapon just because you can deal so much extra damage during bosses' phase transitions. There truly is no other EX that outranks that of Lobber's in my opinion. It's a shame Lobber scores so low in our other 2 categories, because otherwise Lobber would be a very good contender for my top 3. Next up in number 4, just 1 point above Lobber with a score of 17 out of 30, we have Spread. Spread is a low-range, high-damage weapon that spreads bolts outwards, hence the name Spread. Spread deals so much damage, in fact, that it has the highest DPS of any weapon. For practicality, I've given Spread a 6. This weapon does such a good job at getting rid of bosses if you can get right up next to them. But similar to Lobber's case, that's the main problem here. For many bosses, you just can't get close enough to deal max damage, which really sets Spread back. Now, if Spread's damage output wasn't so high, I definitely have to deduct a few points here, but overall this is quite a fair weapon, so a 6 is what I'll be giving it. I do have to bring Spread back 1 point to a score of 5 in the usage category, however. There are a good deal of bosses that I use Spread on regularly, like Peppy the Clown, Sally Stage Play, and others, but because of its low range, I can't bump up Spread any further despite its massive damage output. Moving on to the EX category, I'm scoring Spread a 6. The Spread EX basically spawns 8 spikes around you that travel outwards until they come into contact with an enemy or travel off screen. This EX can deal so much damage if you get in the middle of a boss's hitbox, but again we run into Spread's reoccurring problem. Many bosses' hitboxes will damage you if you jump up into them, so oftentimes getting in full damage with a Spread EX will sacrifice HP. Because of this, I did have to deduct some points here, but not too much, because when you can get Spread's EX to work, it's just a beast. Overall, Spread is a great weapon when you have the opportunity to focus on damage, but it's staying out of the top 3 because in many scenarios, range is just too much of an issue. Starting off the 3 best weapons in Cuphead, just barely surpassing spread with a score of 18 out of 30, we have Crackshot. Crackshot is all in all just a really solid weapon and is a great pick for any boss. This is why I'm scoring Crackshot a perfect 10 in practicality. Crackshot fires out crystal projectiles that break into smaller arrow-like projectiles that deal less damage but also lock onto enemies. Unlike Chaser, Crackshot's damage output is quite reasonable, and the fact that you don't have to worry about aiming with this weapon is a huge lifesaver. But if you do decide to aim at bosses, you will be rewarded with extra damage, which is a huge win as well. Weapons could literally not get more practical, as even though Crackshot might not be the perfect weapon in every situation, it is a solid, respectable pick that holds up to every boss. Even though Crackshot is very practical, I don't personally use it as much as the next 2 weapons on this list, so I'm averaging it out at a score of 5. Crackshot is the perfect weapon for beginning players, but as I've progressed and gotten better at the game, I switched over to weapons that require a bit more skill but can also maximize damage output. Because of this, there are many bosses I just don't use Crackshot on. That being said, because of how practical I believe Crackshot to be, I'll never eliminate it from my loadout, as Crackshot is so good for bosses such as the Howling Aces, Keg Incarnation, and others. Unfortunately, Crackshot receives its lowest score, which is a 3 in the EX category. Using this EX will spawn a turret that shoots a few times at enemies. You can parry this turret to launch a rocket projectile at bosses as well. It's great to set off Crackshot's turret and let it do its thing without having any other worries. The problem is that this EX doesn't really do much damage. Parrying the turret will deal 14 damage, and letting it shoot off its bullets will result in 12 damage. You can parry the turret before it's finished shooting all of its bullets, but even achieving max damage, which isn't that much anyway, is not a simple task. If Crackshot's EX did more damage, we might very well see this weapon in the top 2, but that's just not the case. However, all in all, Crackshot remains a super solid pick for every boss, but our next 2 weapons just take it a little step further in my opinion. Our runner-up weapon with a score of 23 out of 30 is Roundabout. This weapon all in all is such a good pick, and I don't think there's a single boss where this weapon is bad. So it's no surprise that I'm scoring Roundabout a perfect 10 in practicality. Roundabout shoots out boomerang-like projectiles that first travel forwards and then travel backwards with increased range. First off, Roundabout has a great damage output, and because of Roundabout's boomerang-like effect, almost all of your shots will be hitting the boss you're fighting, resulting in a lot of damage. Roundabout also requires very little aim, which is great for beginning players, so that only bumps this weapon up in practicality as well. Moving on to usage, Roundabout is quite decent here, scoring an 8. Again, because of how practical I think Roundabout is, this has always been a weapon I've defaulted to. While there are some situations and bosses where I don't use this weapon, it pairs so well with my favorite weapon, which we'll be getting into in a moment, so I had to give it a good score here. However, Roundabout's score drops to a 5 in the EX category. Roundabout's EX will shoot out a saw that travels back and forth, which disappears after doing so a few times or if you come into contact with it. This EX will actually do a lot of damage if you can get it to hit, but like many of the EXs that don't score well on this list, that's the problem. As I said, Roundabout's EX will disappear if it touches you at any point, but after traveling a short distance, this EX will return backwards in your direction. So in order to do full damage, you will have to jump over the EX when it comes towards you and send it back at the boss you're fighting. In most situations, this is extremely impractical and almost impossible to use if a boss is directly above you. This really brings Roundabout's score down, but because this EX does do a decent bit of damage, even when you don't use it to its full potential, I'll be averaging it out at a score of 5. Besides Roundabout's EX, I have nothing but praise to say about this weapon, as it's so practical in almost every situation, all while having a great damage output. But this now brings us to our number 1 weapon, scoring a 27 out of 30, which is Charge. Unlike the uncharged charge shot, which came out at the bottom of this list, the charge shot rises high above every weapon in my opinion. Holding down the shoot button will charge up your shot, and letting it go will release your shots. It's quite a simple weapon, but utterly effective if used right, which is why I'm giving Charge an 8 in practicality. Firstly, the damage output of this weapon is insane, with each charge shot dealing a whopping 46 damage according to the Cuphead wiki. If you get the timing done perfectly, the charge shot has a DPS of about 35, which is the second highest in the game. On top of Charge's high damage output, its range is also great as well. I find that in almost every situation I'm able to hit bosses with this weapon, which is another huge plus. I find the act of having full control over how many of your shots are on screen at once very appealing and so helpful for situations such as Grim Match 6 Final Phase. However, there are a few reasons I'm not giving Charge a perfect score in this category. First off, this weapon requires a good deal of skill to truly get the hang of, so for most beginning players, Charge is just not going to be a good option. precision. I don't find this an issue since I've had so much practice refining my use of this weapon, but if you're just trying to play Cuphead casually, charge might not be the most practical pick. Secondly, every time you dash or use an EX or super, your charge shot will be released whether it's fully charged or not. So you really have to make good use of dashing and only doing so when you have a full charge shot built up, which in some cases isn't very practical. That being said, I feel with practice at this game, the charge shot will only become easier to use, and the better and better I've gotten at Cuphead, my love for this weapon has only grown because of its incredibly high damage output. Which brings us to the category of usage, in which I've given charge a perfect 10. As I've already talked about, I think charge is just so useful in almost every situation. On bosses where you have to dodge a lot, other weapons that reward aiming will fall behind because you don't have the luxury to do so, whereas with charge you can just charge up your next shot while dodging and deal a high amount of damage in a split second. Charge is always my primary weapon, and I default to it as used correctly, it will make such short work of almost every boss. Moving on to our final category, I've scored Charge's EX a 9. Charge's EX sends out an energy burst with an area of effect damage. While this EX has a short range, it's still very effective. It deals 26 damage according to the Cuphead wiki, which isn't quite as good as some other EXs, but still pretty solid. The main reason I'm so fond of Charge's EX is because of how easy it is to use. You just get close to the boss you want to damage and get off your EX. You don't have to worry about getting damaged by a boss's hitbox, and as long as your EX lands, it will automatically deal full damage. This EX works in perfect combination with the charge shot itself, as if you have a charge shot and an EX built up, you can press the EX button, dealing both EX damage and releasing your charge shot, which will result in a ton of damage. My only complaints about Charge's EX is that the range is a little short and it doesn't have quite the best damage output, although it's pretty dang close, so a 9 is where I'm putting charge in this category. All in all, charge does require a good deal of skill and practice to learn, but once you've mastered it, you can make such quick work of bosses, and I honestly could not ask for a better weapon. But that concludes my ranking of every weapon in Cuphead. If you agree or disagree with my picks, let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what y'all have to say. If you enjoyed this video, dropping a like would go a long way, and consider subscribing if you aren't already. I just want to say a quick thanks for over 1,000 subscribers. This is just such a huge milestone, and I really do appreciate all of you who watch my content. But if you want to check out another ranking video of mine, check out the video on screen where I rank every S rank in Cuphead, or if you're interested in a Cuphead challenge video, check out this video where I challenge my friends to a 1v1 speedrun with a twist. Peace out, fellas.